Whispers called her a cursed widow, destined to lose her Texas ranch to a ruthless banker. Margaret believed her days of passion were forever buried beneath the sun-baked soil. That was before a dangerously young drifter with gunsmoke eyes rode in, igniting a scandalous, forbidden fire that defied time itself. The year was 1888, and the earth of the Broken Yoke Ranch was baked as hard as a potter's kiln. Margaret Callahan stood on the wraparound porch of her homestead, a damp rag pressed to the back of her neck, watching the heat shimmering in waves across the dying prairie. At 43, Margaret was a woman carved from the landscape she tried so desperately to tame. The premature silver in her dark hair and the deep lines around her storm-grey eyes were maps of grief and hard labor. It had been 4 years since her husband, William, was thrown from a spooked gelding and broke his neck, leaving her with a mountain of debt, 100 head of starving cattle, and a relentless, gnawing loneliness. The town of Oak Haven, Texas, had long expected her to fail. The local bank manager, a vulture of a man named Josiah Sterling, rode out every month to remind her of the overdue notes, his eyes sweeping over her property and her with a predatory hunger. Margaret had sold off her finest silver, her mother's cameo, and even the herd's best breeding bull, just to buy another season. She was drowning in the dust of her own stubborn pride. That was the afternoon Beau rode in. He didn't arrive with the fanfare of a hero. He came trailing the slow, rhythmic sound of a horse that had walked too many miles without water. Margaret reached for the Winchester rifle, leaning against the porch rail as the silhouette materialized through the heat haze. When the rider pulled up to the hitching post, the sheer youth of him struck Margaret like a physical blow. He swung down from the saddle with an easy, fluid grace. He couldn't have been more than 24. His skin was deeply bronzed, his jawline sharp and unyielding beneath the shadow of a weathered Stetson. But it was his eyes that caught her, a striking, unsettling shade of amber, old and tired in a face that was far too young. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the dry air. "Name's Beau. Beau Prescott. Heard in town you might be needing a hand." Margaret kept her grip on the rifle. "Town talks too much. Even if I did need a hand. Mr. Prescott, I can't afford to pay you. And frankly, this ain't a place for a boy looking for an adventure." A muscle feathered in Beau's jaw. He didn't flinch at the insult. Instead, he stepped closer to the porch, removing his hat. "I ain't looking for an adventure. Mrs. Callahan, I'm looking for work. I don't need wages for the first month. Just 3 square meals, a place in the barn, and your word that if I prove my worth, you'll pay me fair when the herd sells." Margaret studied him. He looked ragged, his canvas duster coated in trail dust, his boots worn down at the heels. But his hands were calloused, and the Colt revolver sitting at his hip was well oiled and maintained. She was desperate. Her fences were down in the north pasture. Coyotes were taking the calves, and her own bones ached with a weariness she couldn't sleep off. 3 meals. "The barn," she echoed, her voice cold, though her heart pounded a strange rhythm against her ribs. "You sleep with the horses, and if I catch you slacking, or drinking, or looking at me sideways, I'll put a bullet in your leg before I run you off. Understood?" A slow, devastating ghost of a smile touched the corner of Beau's mouth. "Yes, ma'am. I understand perfectly." Over the next 3 weeks, Beau Prescott breathed life back into the dying lungs of the Broken Yoke. Margaret watched him with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant awe. He worked with a brutal, punishing intensity, as if he were trying to outrun a demon only he could see. He mended miles of barbed wire under the scorching sun, his shirt discarded, revealing shoulders corded with lean muscle and a back scarred by what looked like an old, violent whip mark. Margaret found herself standing by the kitchen window longer than necessary, her hands buried in bread dough, her eyes lingering on the way the sweat gleamed on his skin. She hated herself for it. She was old enough to be his mother, well, almost. The gap in their years felt like a physical canyon. She was a woman hardened by loss and impending ruin. He was a beautiful, dangerous force of nature with his whole life stretching out before him. But the silence between them began to shift. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of strangers anymore. It became something charged. One evening, after a grueling day of branding strays. Margaret brought a plate of stew out to the barn. She found Beau sitting on an overturned crate, meticulously cleaning his revolver by the light of a single kerosene lantern. He looked up as she approached, his amber eyes catching the golden flame. "You work too hard." "Mr. Prescott," she said quietly, handing him the plate. He set the gun aside and took the food, his fingers brushing against hers. The brief contact sent a jolt of electricity up Margaret's arm. She hastily pulled her hand back, crossing her arms over her chest defensively. A man works hard when he's got something worth working for. "Maggie," he murmured, using her given name for the first time. The intimacy of it hung in the humid air between them. Margaret's spine stiffened. "It's Mrs. Callahan to you." Beau took a slow bite of the stew, his eyes never leaving her face. "Whatever you say. Mrs. Callahan. But out here in the dark, titles don't mean much. Do they?" She turned on her heel and practically fled back to the house, her breath coming short and shallow. She locked the heavy oak door behind her and leaned against it, pressing a trembling hand to her lips. She was terrified. Not of the debt, not of Josiah Sterling, but of the sudden, violent reawakening of her own deadened heart. The gossip in Oak Haven ignited like dry brush. Margaret rarely went into town, but when she did, the whispers followed her down the wooden boardwalks. Look at the widow Callahan, taking in a stray dog. A boy. No less Lord knows what goes on out there on that isolated spread. Old Mrs. Gable practically snapped her neck, turning to watch Margaret and Beau load sacks of grain into the wagon. Beau ignored the stares with icy indifference, but Margaret felt the weight of their judgment settling like stones in her stomach. She felt foolish, humiliated by the town's assumptions, even though nothing untoward had happened. But the guilt in her chest burned bright, because she wanted something to happen. The pressure from the outside world came to a boiling point on a humid Tuesday afternoon. The sky above the Texas hills had turned a bruised, violent purple, heavy with the promise of a torrential summer storm. Margaret was in the stables, frantically trying to calm a skittish mare, when the unmistakable sound of a heavy carriage rolling into the yard reached her ears. She stepped out of the barn just as Josiah Sterling stepped down from his lacquered buggy. Sterling was a broad-shouldered man with a perfectly waxed mustache and a gaze that stripped a person down to their lowest value. "Afternoon." "Margaret," Sterling drawled, casually flicking a speck of dust from his tailored lapel. "The skies look angry, just like my board of directors. You're 60 days late on your premium." Margaret wiped her dirt-stained hands on her apron, lifting her chin. "I told you, Josiah, the cattle go to market next month. You'll get your money." "I don't want the money anymore." "Margaret," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr as he closed the distance between them. He reached out, his thick fingers grabbing her wrist in a vice grip. "I want the land. The railroad is coming through this valley, and the broken yoke is sitting right on the prime surveying line. Sign the deed over to me today, and I'll forgive the debt. Refuse, and I'll have the sheriff out here by Friday to foreclose. You'll leave with nothing but the clothes on your back." "Let me go," Margaret hissed, struggling against his grip. "You're a stubborn, foolish old woman." Sterling began. The sickening crack of bone meeting bone echoed across the yard. Sterling stumbled backward, releasing Margaret as he crashed into the dirt, blood instantly welling from his split lip. Standing over him, trembling with a terrifying, silent rage, was Bo. His chest heaved, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. "The lady told you to let her go," Bo said, his voice dropping an octave, sounding like a rusted blade dragging across stone. Sterling spat a mouthful of blood into the dirt and looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took in the young cowboy. A strange flicker of recognition, and then malicious amusement flashed across the banker's face. "Well, well," Sterling sneered, wiping his mouth with a silk handkerchief as he struggled to his feet. "If it isn't the runaway, playing the white knight for a barren widow. Does she know who you really are? Boy, does she know where you came from?" Bo's hand dropped instinctively to the butt of his Colt. "Get off this land, Sterling, before I put you in it." Sterling chuckled darkly, climbing back into his carriage. "Friday. Margaret, have your bags packed." As the carriage disappeared in a cloud of dust, the sky finally broke. The rain came down in silver sheets, instantly turning the parched earth into thick, sucking mud. Margaret stood frozen in the deluge, her heart hammering against her ribs, staring at Bo's rigid back. "What did he mean?" she yelled over the roar of the rain. "Bo, what did he mean? Who you really are?" Bo didn't answer. He turned and marched toward the barn, his shoulders hunched against the downpour. Margaret chased after him, her boots slipping in the mud. She caught up to him just as he reached the dim, dry sanctuary of the barn, grabbing his arm and spinning him around. "Don't you walk away from me," she cried, the adrenaline and fear finally breaking her composure. "I have a right to know. Are you in trouble with the law? Are you connected to him?" Bo looked down at her. The anger in his face melted into something far more dangerous, raw, unshielded desperation. He reached out, his large hands gripping her shoulders, pulling her out of the cold draft of the doorway and into the warm shadows of the hay-scented barn. "It doesn't matter," he said fiercely, water dripping from his dark hair onto his face. "None of it matters except this." He didn't give her a chance to speak. Bo's mouth crashed down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It tasted of rain and fury and years of suppressed, agonizing want. Margaret gasped into his mouth, her hands instinctively coming up to push him away. But the moment her palms hit his solid, heaving chest, her resolve shattered. Her fingers curled into his wet shirt, holding on to him like a drowning woman. He backed her up against the rough timber of a horse stall, his arms wrapping around her waist, lifting her slightly off her feet. The heat radiating from him chased away the chill of the storm. For a few blinding seconds, Margaret forgot her age, her debts, and the crushing reality of her life. She was just a woman, wholly consumed by the fire of the man holding her. But as suddenly as it began, reality clawed its way back into her mind, The voices of the townspeople, Sterling's mocking sneer. A foolish old woman. Margaret tore her mouth away, gasping for air, pressing her hands hard against his chest to put space between them. She was shaking violently, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "No," she choked out, her voice breaking. She looked up into his amber eyes, which were dark with desire and confusion. "Bo, stop. We can't." "Maggie," he whispered, leaning in again. She turned her face away, shame washing over her in a suffocating wave. "I am too old for you," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I have a lifetime of ghosts. Bo, I'm a worn-out widow about to lose everything. You have your whole life. I won't let you tie yourself to my sinking ship. I am too old for you." Bo stared at her, his chest rising and falling heavily. He didn't step back. He didn't release her waist. Instead, he reached up, his rough thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. He leaned in, his lips hovering just a fraction of an inch from hers, his breath warm against her trembling mouth. "Then let me be young enough," he whispered back, his voice thick with raw emotion. "Let me be young enough for the both of us." He kissed her again, passionately, completely, shattering the last of her defenses. Margaret surrendered with a sob, wrapping her arms around his neck, pulling him closer as the thunder rattled the barn roof above them. In the shadows, they clung to each other, a desperate rebellion against time and ruin. But as Bo moved to pull off his wet duster, tossing it over a nearby barrel, something slipped from his inner pocket. It hit the straw-covered floor with a soft thud. Margaret, momentarily pulling back to catch her breath, glanced down. Lying in the dirt, partially illuminated by a flash of lightning, was a heavy leather pocketbook. It had fallen open. Inside was a thick stack of crisp $100 bills, more money than the ranch made in 3 years, and a folded telegram. The seal on the telegram was broken, but the signature at the bottom was clearly visible in the stark white flash of the storm. It was signed Josiah Sterling. Margaret's blood ran cold, the warmth of the kiss instantly turning to ice in her veins. Margaret shoved him backward with a violent burst of strength she didn't know she possessed. Bo stumbled against the wooden stall, his eyes wide with sudden confusion. Margaret didn't look at his face. Her gaze was locked on the dirt floor, where the leather pocketbook lay like a venomous snake in the straw. She dropped to her knees, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the damp leather. She snatched up the telegram, holding it toward the faint, flickering light of the lantern. The paper was crisp, the ink stark black. To be Sterling. The widow is broken. Find the original 1872, deed by Friday. J. Gould's surveyors arrive Monday. Do not fail me again. Josiah Sterling. "Maggie," Bo started, taking a step toward her, his voice a low, pleading rasp. "Don't you dare!" Margaret screamed, the sound tearing from her throat like a dying animal. She scrambled backward in the dirt, clutching the telegram and the thick stack of bills to her chest. The rain hammered against the roof, but all she could hear was the rushing roar of her own blood. She looked up at him, truly looking at him for the first time. B. Sterling, the sharp jawline, the arrogant tilt of his head, the way he carried himself with an inherent, ingrained confidence that no ragged drifter ever truly possessed. The resemblance was there, buried under youth and trail dust. "You're his son," she whispered, the horror of the realization washing over her in icy waves. You're Josiah's son." Beau's jaw tightened. The warm, passionate boy who had just kissed the breath from her lungs vanished, replaced by a hardened, bitter man. "I am a bastard," he corrected, his voice flat. "My mother was a saloon girl in Fort Worth. He never claimed me, never gave me his name legally. But when he needed someone to do his dirty work, he suddenly remembered I existed. You came here to ruin me." Margaret gasped, fighting the bile rising in her throat. Every touch, every lingering glance, the grueling hours he spent mending her fences, it was all a meticulously crafted lie. "He sent you to find the deed, so he could sell the right-of-way to Jay Gould's Texas and Pacific Railway. That's why he wanted the land so badly." "At first, yes," Beau admitted, taking another slow step forward, his hands raised in surrender. "Maggie, listen to me. I came here for the deed. I was going to find it, hand it over, and take my cut. But then I saw how hard you fought. I saw what he was doing to you. And then I fell for you. I swear to God. Maggie, everything changed." "Liar." Margaret scrambled to her feet, dropping the pocketbook and the money as if it burned her flesh. She lunged for the barrel where Beau's gun belt lay discarded, ripping the heavy Colt revolver from its holster. She leveled the barrel directly at his chest. The gun was heavy, her arms trembled, but her finger was steady on the trigger. Beau froze. The amber eyes that had looked at her with such intense devotion just moments ago now stared down the dark barrel of his own weapon. "Maggie, put the gun down," he said softly. "Look at the money. It's his. I stole it from his office safe in Oak Haven yesterday while he was at the Assayers. $5,000. It's enough to pay off your debt to the bank board directly, bypassing him entirely. I was going to give it to you." "Why didn't you?" she demanded, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "Because I knew the second you found out who I was. You'd look at me exactly the way you're looking at me right now." Beau yelled, his composure finally snapping. "You think you're too old for me. You think you're unlovable. I am the bastard son of the most hated man in Texas. I have a ledger of sins, a mile long. I wanted one thing in my miserable life to be pure. And that was you. I was trying to figure out how to save you, without losing you." The silence in the barn stretched, broken only by the steady drumming of the rain and the nervous shifting of the horses in their stalls. Margaret's heart was a shattered, bleeding thing. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to drop the gun and fall back into his arms. But the world was a cruel place, and survival demanded cold, hard logic. "Get your horse, Mr. Sterling," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, deadened calm. "Saddle him up and ride out. If I ever see you on the broken yoke again, I will shoot you dead, and I won't lose a wink of sleep over it." Beau stared at her, searching her storm-grey eyes for any sign of hesitation. He found none. He slowly reached down, picked up his leather duster, and pulled it over his shoulders. He left the money and the telegram in the dirt. "I love you, Margaret Callahan," he said quietly, "whether you believe it or not." He turned and walked out into the torrential storm. Margaret stood frozen, holding the heavy gun, listening to the rhythmic splash of hooves fading into the thundering night. When she was finally alone, the gun slipped from her fingers, hitting the straw. She sank to her knees in the dirt, covered her face with her mud-stained hands, and wept until she had nothing left. Friday morning broke clear and bright, the storm gone, but its aftermath lingering in the heavy scent of wet earth. Margaret stood on the porch in her black morning dress, calm and unyielding. If she was to lose everything, she would do it with dignity. The stolen money inside remained untouched. She refused to save herself with something tainted. At 9 sharp, they arrived. Josiah Sterling rode in first, flanked by Sheriff Miller and 2 deputies. Their slow approach stretched the tension tight. Margaret rested her Winchester against her arm, steady and unafraid. "You know why we're here," the sheriff said quietly. "It's over, Margaret." "It's not," she replied. "This land is mine, and Sterling is a fraud." Sterling scoffed, urging the sheriff forward. Miller hesitated, then stepped closer. "Please, don't make this worse." Margaret raised the rifle slightly. "I'm not leaving." A gun clicked, then a voice cut through the air. "The only mistake is you being here." All heads turned. Bo rode out from the trees, flanked by armed agents and a sharply dressed lawyer. He stopped between Margaret and the sheriff. "This ends now," he said. The lawyer stepped forward, unrolling a document. "Josiah Sterling, you are removed for fraud and embezzlement." Silence fell. Margaret realized the truth. Bo hadn't betrayed her. He had come back to save her. "Drop it, Josiah." Sheriff Miller barked, drawing his own weapon in a flash, the deputies following suit. The Pinkertons instantly leveled their repeaters at the disgraced banker. Sterling froze, surrounded by guns, his hand hovering over his chest. He looked at Bo with sheer, unadulterated hatred. "You ruined me. Your own flesh and blood." "You were never my blood," Bo said, his voice as cold as ice. "Sheriff, I believe Mr. Vance has a warrant for his arrest." Miller nodded grimly. "Harrison, Cobb, cuff him." It took less than 5 minutes for the yard to clear. Sterling was dragged away, shouting curses that were swallowed by the vast Texas sky. "Mr." Vance handed Margaret a sealed envelope containing the cleared deed to the broken yoke, paid in full by the very funds Sterling had stolen from his own bank's reserves, legally applied to her debt by the board as restitution. As the procession disappeared over the ridge, silence fell over the ranch once more. Bo remained mounted, his hands resting on the saddle horn. He looked completely drained, the adrenaline fading to leave behind only raw exhaustion. He didn't move toward the house. "I reckon I'll be moving on now," Bo said quietly, his eyes fixed on the horizon, not daring to look at her. "I brought trouble to your door. Maggie, I lied to you. I did what I had to do to fix it. But I know it don't erase the deception. You got your land back. You're safe." He pulled the reins, turning his horse back toward the trail. Beauregard, the sound of his full name, spoken in her voice, stopped him cold. He turned his head. Margaret had lowered the Winchester. She walked down the porch steps, the hem of her black morning dress dragging through the mud. She didn't care. She walked right up to the side of his horse, her storm-grey eyes locked onto his amber ones. She saw the vulnerability there, the deep, aching fear of rejection that mirrored her own. He had sacrificed his freedom, his anonymity, and risked federal prison to save a woman who had pulled a gun on him. "You rode to Fort Worth and back in 3 days," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I had good motivation," he replied, a rough edge to his tone. "You're an arrogant, reckless, infuriating boy," Margaret whispered, reaching up to lay her hand against his muddy boot. Bo closed his eyes, a muscle feathering in his jaw. "I know. But," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "You are the most honorable man I have ever known." Beau opened his eyes, staring down at her in disbelief. Margaret reached up, grabbing the collar of his duster, and pulled him down toward her. He slid out of the saddle effortlessly, landing in the mud right in front of her. She didn't give him a chance to speak. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him, right there in the broad daylight, in the open yard of the broken yoke. It was a kiss of forgiveness, of fierce gratitude, and of an undeniable, earth-shattering love. Beau groaned, wrapping his arms around her waist, lifting her into the air and burying his face in the crook of her neck. When he finally set her down, they were both breathless, covered in mud, and smiling for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "I meant what I said in the barn," Margaret murmured, resting her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "I have ghosts, Beau. I have wrinkles and grey hair, and I am set in my ways." Beau tilted her chin up with a calloused finger, his amber eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering devotion. "And I meant what I said," he whispered, leaning down to press a kiss against her temple. "Let me be young enough for the both of us. We've got a whole ranch to run. Maggie, we don't have time to worry about the years." And as the Texas sun beat down on the newly liberated soil of the broken yoke, Margaret Callahan finally let go of the past, stepping boldly into the fire of a future she never thought she'd live to see. If this tale of forbidden love, betrayal, and untamed frontier justice kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Share this story with a fellow romance lover. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more sweeping, real-life Wild West dramas delivered straight to you every week. What would you have done in Margaret's boots? Tell us in the comments below.